So this is The Big Trip Up Yonder by Kurt Vonnegut. Gramps Ford, his chin resting on his hands on the crook of his cane, was staring irascibly at the 5-foot television screen that dominated the room. On the screen, a news commentator was summarizing the day's happenings. Every 30 seconds or so, Gramps would jab the floor with his cane tip and shout, "Hell, we did that 100 years ago." Emerald and Lou, coming in from the balcony where they had been seeking that 2185 AD rarity, privacy, were obliged to take their seats in the back row, behind Lou's father and mother, brother and sister-in-law, son and daughter-in-law, grandson and wife, granddaughter and husband, great-grandson and wife, nephew and wife, great-nephew and wife, great-grandniece and husband, great grandnephew and wife, and of course Gramps, who was in front of everybody. All save Gramps, who was somewhat withered and bent, seemed by pre-anti-Garrison standards to be about the same age, someone in their late 20s or early 30s. Gramps looked older because he had already reached 70 when anti-kerosene was invented. He had not aged in the 102 years since. Meanwhile, the commentator was saying, Council Bluffs, Iowa is threatened by stark tragedy, but 200 wary rescue workers have refused to give up hope and continue to dig in an effort to save Elbert Hagerdorn, 183, who has been wedged for 2 days in a I wish he'd get to something more cheerful, Emerald whispered to Lou. Silence, Gramps cried. Next one shoots off his big bazoo while the TV's on is gonna find himself cut off without a dollar. His voice suddenly softened and sweetened. When they were that checkered flag at the Indianapolis Speedway and old Gramps gets ready for the big trip up yonder. He sniffed sentimentally while his heirs concentrated desperately on not making the slightest sound. For them, the poignancy of the prospective big trip had been dulled somewhat through having been mentioned by Gramps about once a day for 50 years. Dr. Brainard Kiels Bullard, continued the commentator, president of Wyandotte College, said in an address tonight that most of the world's ills can be traced to the fact that man's knowledge of himself has not kept pace with his knowledge of the physical world. Hell, snorted Gramps, we said that 100 years ago. In Chicago tonight, the commentator went on, a special celebration is taking place in the Chicago Lying In Hospital. The guest of honor is Lau W. Hitz, age 0. Hitz, born this morning in the 25th millionth child to be born in the hospital, the commentator faded and was replaced by the screen by a young Hitz, who squalled furiously. Hell, whispered Lute Emerald. We said that 100 years ago. I heard that, shouted Gramps. He snapped out the television set and his petrified descendant stared silently at the screen. You there, boy! I didn't mean anything by it, sir, said Lou, aged 103. Get me my will, you know where it is. You kids all know where it is. Fetch, boy. Gramps snapped his snarled fingers sharply. Lou nodded dully and found himself going down the hall, picking his way over bedding to Gramps' room, the only private room in the Ford apartment. The other rooms were the bathroom, the living room, and the wide windowless hallway, which were originally intended to serve as a dining area, and which had a kitchenette in one end. 6 mattresses and 4 sleeping bags were dispersed in the hallway and living room, and the daybed in the living room accommodated the 11th couple, the favorites of the moment. On Gramps' bureau was his will, smeared, dog-eared, perforated, and blotched with hundreds of additions, deletions, accusations, conditions, warnings, advice, and homely philosophy. The document was, Lou reflected, a 50-year-old diary all jammed onto 2 sheets, a garbled, illegible log of a day after day of strife. This day, Lou would be disinherited for the 11th time, and it would take him perhaps 6 months of impeccable behavior to regain promise of a share in the estate, to say nothing of the daybed in the living room for Em and himself. Boy! Called Gramps. Coming, sir. Lou hurried into the living room and handed Gramps a will. Pen, said Gramps. He was instantly offered 11 pens, one from each couple. Not that leaking thing, he said, brushing Lou's pen aside. Ah, there's a nice one. Good boy, Willie. He accepted Willie's pen. That was the tip they had all been waiting for. Willie, then, Lou's father, was a new favorite. Willie, who looked almost as young as Lou, though he was 142, did a poor job concealing his pleasure. He glanced shyly at the daybed, which would become his, and from which Lou and Emerald would have to move back into the hall, back to the worst spot of all, by the bathroom door. Gramps missed none of the high drama he had authored, and he gave his own familiar role everything he had, frowning and running his finger along each line as though he were seeing the will for the first time. He read aloud in a deep, portentous monotone, like a bass note on a cathedral organ. I, Harold D. Ford, residing in Building 257 of Alden Village, New York City, Connecticut, do hereby publish and declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking any and all former wills and codicils by me at any time heretofore made. He blew his nose importantly and went on, missing a word and repeating many for emphasis, repeating in particular his ever more elaborate specifications for a funeral. At the end of these specifications, Gramps was so choked with emotion that Lou thought he might have forgotten why he'd brought out the will in the first place. But Gramps heroically brought his powerful emotions under control, and after erasing for a full minute, began to write and speak at the same time. Lou could have spoken his lines for him, he heard them so often. I have had many heartbreaks ere leaving this vale of tears for a better land, Gramps said and wrote, but the deepest hurt of all has been dealt me by. He looked around the group, trying to remember who the malefactor was. That would be someone who did something bad. Everyone looked helpfully at Lou, who was held up his hand resignedly. Gramps nodded, remembering and complete the sentence. My great-grandson, Lou J. Ford. Grandson, sir, said Lou. Don't quibble, you're in deep enough now, young man, said Gramps, but he had made the change, and from there he went without misstep to the phrasing of the disinheritance, causes for which were disrespectfulness and quibbling. In the paragraph following, the paragraph had belonged to everyone in the room at one time or another. Lou's name was scratched out, and Willie substituted as heir to the apartment. The biggest plum of all, the double bed in the private bedroom. So, said Gramps, beaming, you erase the date at the foot of the will and substitute a new one, including the time of day. Will, time to watch the McGarvey family. The McGarvey family was a television serial that Gramps had been following since he was 60, or for a total of 112 years. I can't wait to see what's going to happen next, he said. Okay, so all of this is like your exposition, really. We learn who all these characters are. We learn our setting is 2185. We learn the conflict. We have the patriarch of this family, Gramps, and there is a medical advancement where no one is dying. And this seems to be what is the result of that. We also get some humor here, but we might want to think, is this supposed to be humorous? You could compare this to like a reality show nowadays, maybe a Kardashian reality show, where people would just be watching the same shows for almost a hundred years. You would say that the society is stagnant. They have all these medical advancements, and yet everyone is sitting around watching the same television show. Even the dialogue of the family, where they keep saying, that was 100 years ago. We're definitely seeing that nothing in this society is changing, which is stagnation, which is usually not good. Let's see. Lou detached himself from the group and lay down on his bed of pain by the bathroom door, wishing Em would join him. He wondered where she was. He dozed for a few moments until he was disturbed by someone stepping over him to get into the bathroom. A moment later, he heard a faint gurgling sound as though something were being poured down the wash basin drain. Suddenly it entered his mind that Em had cracked up, that she was in there doing something drastic about Gramps. And here we have the point of view. So we know Lou's point of view in the story. You could say that Lou is a protagonist. And his conflict is he wants privacy. He's out of the will. The Gramps seems to single him out. So it would be Lou versus Gramps. He has disappointed the grandpa, and now the grandpa is going to take him out of this will. And we can also assume if every single person in the family is dependent on this house, we can assume that the population has increased in a way that maybe land is scarce. He whispered through the panel. There was no reply, and Lou pressed against the door. The worn lock, whose bolt barely engaged its socket, held for a second, then let the door swing inward. Morty, gasped Lou. Lou's great grandnephew Mortimer, who had just married and brought his wife home to the Ford menage, looked at Lou with consternation and surprise. Morty kicked the door shut, but not before Lou had glimpsed what was in his hand. Gramps' enormous economy-sized bottle of anti-garrison, which had apparently been half emptied, and which Morty was refilling with tap water. A moment later, Morty came out, glared defiantly at Lou, and brushed past his wordlessly to rejoin his pretty bride. Shocked, Lou didn't know what to do. He couldn't let Gramps take the mouse-trapped anti-garrison, and if he warned Gramps about it, Gramps would certainly make life in the apartment, which was merely insufferable now, harrowing. Harrowing is like dangerous. Insufferable just means like super not good. Everybody's suffering, but like harrowing is now they're in danger. Lou glanced into the living room and saw that Ford's, Emerald among them, were momentarily at rest, relishing the botches that the McGarveys had made of their lives. Stealthily, he went into the bathroom, locked the door as well as he could, and began to pour the contents of Grandpa's bottle down the drain. He was going to refill it with full-strength anti-garrison from the 22 smaller bottles on the shelf. The bottle contained a half-gallon, and its neck was small, so it seemed to Lou that the emptying would take forever. An almost imperceptible smell of anti-garrison, like Worcester sauce, now seemed to Lou in his nervousness to be pouring out into the rest of the apartment, through the keyhole and under the door. So it has a distinct odor, and now he's getting nervous. The bottle gurgled monotonously. Suddenly up came from the sound of music from the living room, and there were murmurs and the scraping of chairs' legs on the floor. Thus ends, said the television announcer, the 29,121st chapter in the life of your neighbors and mine, the McGarveys. Footsteps were coming down the hall. There was a knock on the bathroom door. Just a sec, Lou cheerfully called out. Desperately, he shook the big bottle, trying to speed up the flow. His palms slipped on the wet glass, and the heavy bottle smashed on the tile floor. The door was pushed open, and Gramps, dumbfounded, stared at the incriminating mess. Lou felt a hideous prickling sensation on his scalp and back of his neck. He grinned engagingly through his nausea, and for want of anything remotely resembling a thought, waited for Gramps to speak. Well, boy, said Gramps at last, looks like you got a little tidying up to do. And that was all he said. He turned around, elbowed his way through the crowd, and locked himself in his bedroom. Forbes contemplated Lou in an incredulous silence a moment longer, and then hurried back to the living room as though some of his horrible guilt would taint them too, if they looked too long. Morty stayed behind long enough to give Lou a quizzical, annoyed glance. Then he also went into the living room, leaving only Emerald standing in the doorway. Tears streamed over her cheeks. You poor lamb, please don't look so awful. It was my fault. I put you up with my nagging about Gramps. No, said Lou, finding his voice. Really, you didn't. Honest, Em, I was just. You don't have to explain anything to me, hon. I'm on your side no matter what. She kissed him on one cheek and whispered in his ear, It wouldn't have been murder, hon. It wouldn't have killed him. It wasn't such a terrible thing to do. It just would have fixed him up so he'd be able to go anytime God decided he wanted him. Okay, so this is M justifying. So she is unaware that Lou was actually fixing the anti-garrison to save the Grams from the others, from Mortimer. But we learn her point of view. M's point of view is she would have been totally okay with Gramps dying without his anti-garrison. And then you could also ask yourself, is this poisoning if you're taking away a medicine that's letting the person live forever? Yeah, probably. "What's going to happen next, Em?" said Lou hollowly. "What's he going to do?" Lou and Emerald stayed fearfully awake almost all night, waiting to see how Gramps was going to do. But not a sound came from the sacred bedroom. 2 hours before dawn, they finally dropped off to sleep. At 6 o'clock they rose again, for it was time for their generation to eat breakfast in the kitchenette. No one spoke to them. They had 20 minutes in which to eat, but their reflexes were so dulled by the bad night that they had hardly swallowed 2 mouthfuls of egg-type processed seaweed before it was time to surrender their places to their son's generation. Then, as was the custom for whoever had been most recently disinherited, they began preparing Gramps' breakfast, which would presently be served to him in bed on a tray. They tried to be cheerful about it. The toughest part of the job was having to handle the honest to God eggs and bacon and oleomargarine on which Gramps spent so much of his income from his fortune. Okay, the word choice here. The toughest part of the job was having to handle the honest to God eggs and bacon and oleomargarine. Okay, oleomargarine would be made up, but why would Kurvanga use this adjective, honest to God eggs? Well, said Emerald, I'm not going to get all panicky until I'm sure there's nothing to be panicky about. Maybe he doesn't know what it was. I busted, Lou said hopefully. Probably thinks it was your watch, Crystal, offered Eddie, their son, who was toying apathetically with his buckwheat-type processed sawdust cakes. Don't get sarcastic with your father, said Em, and don't talk with your mouth full either. Okay, when he says God honest eggs, that's supposed to be a contrast. Lou is eating sawdust. And then, Eddie, their son is eating sawdust. And then the parents are eating an egg type processed seaweed. So clearly, with this population, overpopulation, we now have a food scarcity. That's why the eggs are so miraculous, and the other food is not food that we're consuming at this point in our timeline. I'd like to see anybody take a mouthful of this stuff and not say something, complained Eddie, who was 73. He glanced at the clock. It's time to take Gramps' breakfast, you know. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Said Lou weakly. He shrugged. Let's have the tray, Em. We'll both go. Walking slowly, smiling bravely, they found a large semicircle of long-faced Fords standing around the bedroom door. Em knocked. Gramps, she called brightly. Breakfast is ready. There was no reply, and she knocked again harder. The door swung open before her fist. In the middle of the room, the soft, deep, wide canopy bed, the symbol of the sweep by and by to every Ford, was empty. A sense of death, as unfamiliar to the Fords as Zoroastrianism or the causes of the Sepoy mutiny, stilled every voice, slowed every heart, awed the heirs began search gingerly under the furniture and behind the drapes, for that was all mortal of Gramps, father of the clan. But Gramps had left a note in his earthly husk, but Gramps had left not his earthly husk, but a note, which Lou finally found on the dresser. Under a paperweight which was treasured souvenir from the World's Fair of 2000. Unsteadily, Lou read it aloud. Somebody who I have sheltered and protected and taught the best I know how all these years last night turned on me like a mad dog and diluted my anti-garrison, or tried to. I am no longer a young man. I can no longer bear the crushing burden of life as I once could. So after last night's bitter experience, I say goodbye. The cares of this world will soon drop away like a cloak of thorns, and I shall know peace. By the time you find this, I will be gone. Diluted would mean like you took some of it out and filled it with water. So this would be Gramps' final note to them. Gosh, Willie said brokenly, he didn't even get to see how the 5,000-mile speedway race was going to come out. Or the Solar Series, said Eddie with large, mournful eyes. Or whether Miss Garvey got her eyesight back, added Morty. There's more, said Lou, and he began reading aloud again. Said Lou, I, Harold Ford, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking any and all former wills and codicils by me at any time heretofore made. So basically, he just null and voided his own will. So now everything that he had said, who gets what, does not exist. No, cried Willie, not another one. I do stipulate, read Lou, that all my property or whatsoever kind and nature not to be divided, but do devise and bequeath it to be held in common by my issue, without regard for generation, equally share and share alike. Issue, said Emerald. Lou included the multitude in a sweep of his hand. It means we all own the whole damn shooting match. Each eye turned instantly to the bed. Share and share alike. So before there was an heir picked to get the room, and now there is no heir. And a shooting match would mean they're going to have to fight for it. Actually, said Willie, who was the oldest one present, it's just like the old system, where the oldest people head up things with their headquarters in here, and I like that, exclaimed Em. Lou owns as much of it as you do, and I say it ought to be for the oldest one who's still working. You can snooze around here all day waiting for your pension check while poor Lou stumbles in here after work, all tuckered out, and how about letting somebody who's never had any privacy get a little crack at it? Eddie demanded hotly. Hell, you old people had plenty of privacy back when you were kids. I was born and raised in the middle of the goddamn barracks in the hall. How about? Yeah, challenged Morty. Sure, you've had it all pretty tough, and my heart bleeds for you, but try honeymooning in the hall for a real kick. Silence, shouted Willie imperiously. The next person who opens his mouth spends the next 6 months by the bathroom. Now clear out of my room, I want to think. A vase shattered against the wall, inches above his head. In the moment, a free-for-all was underway, with each couple battling to eject every other couple from the room. Fighting coalitions were formed and dissolved with lightning changes of the tactical situation. Em and Lou were thrown into the hall, where they organized others in the same situation and stormed back into the room. After 2 hours of struggle with nothing like a decision in sight, the cops broke in, followed by television cameraman from mobile units. For the next half hour, patrol wagons and ambulance hauled away Fords, and then the apartment was still and spacious. An hour later, films of the last stages of the riot were being televised to 500 million delighted viewers on the eastern seaboard. In the stillness of the three-room Ford apartment on the 76th floor of Building 257, television set had been left on. Once more the air filled with the cries and grunts and crashes of the fray, coming harmlessly now from the loudspeaker. The battle also appeared on the screen of the television set in the police station, where the Fords and their captors watched with professional interest. Em and Lou, in adjacent 4x8 cells, were stretched out peacefully on their cots. Adjacent would mean right next to each other. Em called Lou through the partition. You got a wash basin all your own too? A wash basin is just a kitchen, like your sink, but this would have been the 50s, 60s. Sure, wash basin, bed, light, the works. And we thought Gramps' room was something. How long has this been going on? She held out her hand. For the first time in 40 years, hon, I haven't got the shakes. Look at me. The shakes would be a medical condition, literally shaking. You could say that the crowded situation was impacting her health, the lack of privacy, never being alone. Cross your fingers, said Lou. The lawyer's going to try to get us a year. GM said dreamily, I wonder what kind of wires you had to pull to get put away in solitary. Solitary is the United Nations, they say that solitary is cruel and unusual punishment and should never be. It would be when someone was incarcerated or in prison or jail, and they would be in a room all by themselves with no outside communication for typically 23 hours a day, and then you're supposed to get 1 hour outside, but then you're also still by yourself. And it can definitely make people go crazy. There's scientific studies done that it deteriorates the mind and it's very bad for your health. But in this society, you could say this is irony. It is irony that the characters would rather be incarcerated because they get privacy. All right, pipe down, said the turnkey. That would be the guard. And put that, or I'll toss the whole kit and caboodle of you right out. And first one who lets on to anybody outside how good jail is ain't never getting back in. The prisoners instantly fell silent. Here's going to be our resolution. All right, resolution. The falling action is them in jail. So this would be the falling action. The climax is the big giant brawl, point of no return. Now they're in jail. Now, resolution. All the loose ends are tied up. The living room of the apartment darkened for a moment as the riot scenes faded on the television screen, and the face of the announcer appeared like the sun coming from behind a cloud. And now, friends, he said, I have a special message from the makers of Anti-Garrison. A message for all you folks over 50. Are you hampered socially by wrinkles, by stiffness of joints and discoloration and loss of hair? All because these things came upon you before anti-garrison was developed. Well, if you are, you need no suffer longer. You need no longer suffer. Need no longer feel different and out of things. After years of research, medical science has now developed super anti-garrison. In weeks, yes, weeks. You can look, feel, and act as young as your great grandchildren. Great great grandchildren. Wouldn't you pay 5,000 to be indistinguishable from everybody else? Well, you don't have to. Safe, tested, super anti-garrison costs you only a few dollars a day. Right now, for your free trial carton, just put your name and address on a dollar postcard and mail it to Super Box 500,000 Schenectady, NY. Have you got that? I'll repeat it. Super Box 500,000. This would be funny. A P.O. box does not typically go up to 500,000. If you ever go to the post office and see the P.O. boxes, this is supposed to be a joke on the overpopulation. Underlining the announcer's words was the scratching of Gramps' pen. The one Willie had given him the night before. He had come in a few minutes earlier from the Idle Hour Tavern, which commanded a view of Building 257 from across a square of asphalt known as the Alden Village Garden. Oops. He had called the cleaning woman to come straighten the place up, then had hired the very best lawyer in town to get his descendants a conviction. A genius who had never gotten a client less than a year and a day. Gramps had then moved the daybed before the television screen so that he could watch from a reclining position. It was something he dreamed of doing for years. Schenectady, murmured Gramps. Got it. His face had changed remarkably. His facial muscles seemed to have relaxed, revealing kindness and equanimity under what had been taut lines of bad temper. It was almost as though his trial package of super anti-garrison had already arrived. When something amused him on television, he smiled easily, rather than barely managing to lengthen the thin line of his mouth a millimeter. Life was good. He could hardly wait to see what was going to happen next. This is the prequel for To Be or Not to Be. And we can obviously see that things were bad. People were eating not good food. People were hoarding resources. If Gramps would be a symbol of the hierarchy, those that lived the longest and hoarded the most money because they worked and they were working prior to the invention of the garrison. So that means that all the children, if no one was retiring, like, wait, the part about the pension. So they're arguing up here about who should get the privacy. And M talks about how, wait, up here. Sorry. She's talking about how he has work and the other guy just sits and gets a pension. But if we were going to say a pension is something you get when you retire, either from the government or your workplace. And if you're never going to die, then that would mean that the government or your former employer is going to pay you indefinitely. This would never work. So the reader has to assume that you're either working until you die or you're surviving off others. And in this case, it almost seems like some of the family members might be a little bit of freeloaders. But are they really freeloaders? They're all like banding together, maybe helping each other, but they're clearly getting on each other's nerves. And then the irony in the story, Gramps was not dead. Gramps tricked them. And we could say Gramps tricked us, the reader, because I was pretty surprised when I read this the first time. So the irony here, and we have the lawyer. This was Gramps paying for them to have this lawyer. We could maybe say, could this family have a better life if Gramps wasn't maybe so selfish with paying all this money to be young and not even look old? It almost seems like we have some ageism. So ageism is when people that are older in a society are discriminated against or treated badly. And specifically the commercial. Wouldn't you pay 5,000 to be indistinguishable from everybody else? Indistinguishable mean you can't tell the difference. Why does that need to be? If you need to be indistinguishable from other people, then that would mean that the way you looked caused you to get discriminated against in some way. Maybe. So, this would be the big trip yonder. And also, wait, the part about the television crews. Could we maybe say that Kurt Vonnegut, if not only do people not have privacy in their homes, but it's almost like live stream. How would Kurt Vonnegut have predicted in the 1950s that cops were going to be wearing body cameras, or that there would even be a show called Cops where like cops were followed and then filmed, and like there are people arresting people was like on a show on TV? So it seems as the privacy in the individual family unit ebbed or disintegrated. At what point in the society did privacy in all of society disintegrate? We can talk about that in the questions.